Hello everyone. In this video, I want to discuss how to increase your power. I'm sure a lot of gurus or teachers, whatever, have tried to come up with some tricks or strategies or some models to increase power, maybe some stuff about NLP or some kind of persuasion or stuff like that. Now, we are not going to go into any of that. We are going to focus in the inner self, in how just by changing by shifting, let's say, our view of reality, by shifting our perspective, we can achieve a very, very large amount of power over our life. How we can massively increase our power, the influence that we have on our life. Let's take a few examples. So let's say I'm walking down the street, and let's say that it's maybe cold, there is some ice. And sure, some people from the city, they are supposed to clean it, but this part was not cleaned properly. I slip on the ice, I fall, and I break my leg. So what am I going to do? Most people will blame someone else. They will say, oh, they didn't clean it properly, it's their fault. But very few people will blame themselves by saying, well, I should have been more careful. Like knowing that in general, in winter, the floor, I mean, I don't know, the ground, whatever, the street freezes. Knowing that, and knowing that in general, city is not very efficient in cleaning, then I have to be extra careful. Maybe I have to buy specific boots, specific shoes, or I don't know, or take a different road, or only use the car, etc., etc., etc. So, or imagine that, for example, I don't know, you are a businessman or you work in a company and you are kind of a manager and you delegate something to someone. They do a very poor job. And then you say, well, that's his fault. You blame him. He did a poor job. But you could also do a step back and say, well, maybe I shouldn't have delegated to him. Knowing what is his degree of competence, how good he is in general, maybe this task was too difficult. So it was my fault that I delegated to him a task that is excessively difficult. So in the future, I should remember that tasks that are too difficult, I should be extra careful who I delegate them to, or I should check carefully, I should follow up more often, or etc., etc., etc. So this is the trick. I mean, I can give more example, we can discuss more, etc., etc., but it is very simple. The trick is, the more everything is your fault, the more power you have. The less everything is your fault, the less power you have. Once something is your fault, then it is in your control. If it's your fault, it's because it was in your control. You accept, you admit, you recognize that it was in your control. If it's not your fault, if it's someone else's fault, then it was not in your control. That makes you powerless. So it's unfortunate that this person you delegated to was incompetent. He fucked up. And so now it's your problem, but you're a victim. So now you will start to think that you're a victim. There is nothing you can do about it. This is so unfortunate. So now your power will stop. You just become a victim. I mean, maybe it's pleasant for a few minutes to tell yourself that you're a victim, but it's not a great strategy for your life. Whereas if you say, it's my fault, every single thing is my fault. Let's say your son murders someone. It's an extreme example. I was watching some documentary about a story like that. Is it his fault or is it your fault? Well, someone could argue it's both, but we're not in a courtroom. It's more effective for you to believe that it's 100% your fault. Of course, maybe at that point it's unrecoverable because your son will go to jail and blah, blah, blah. There is nothing much you can do. But still, for next time, it's like, well, maybe you didn't educate him the right way. Maybe you were not a good example. Maybe you spoiled him, whatever. Maybe something went wrong. But you can see, I hope by this point in the video, every single time you take responsibility, you say that it's your fault, that gives you power because you realize what you could have done different to change it. So next time you will have more power. And it doesn't matter, even if most people will argue that it's not your fault. And maybe you can, of course, agree with them that publicly that it's not your fault. But inside your head, I think you should always believe it's your fault, no matter how external it is. no matter how far it is from your reach, you should still believe it's your fault. Because if you think about it, and if you do enough step backs, then you can start to think, well, if I had done this and this and this and this, then this will not have happened. Let's take a crazy example. You go into a plane and the plane crashes. Is it your fault? Technically, it's the fault of the pilot, of course, that crashed the plane. But you could also have avoided going into that plane. Now, of course, this is not a great example because one could argue, how could you have known that this plane would have crashed? But still, it's just as an example. I hope you can see the example. So you could say, well, I could just not have stepped in that plane. Or let's say you invest in some company and the CEO fucks up the company. You say the CEO is an idiot, he doesn't know what he's doing, he destroyed the company. Yes, but you invested in the company. You could not have invested. Now, if you take responsibility and say that it's your fault that you invested in the company with the idiot CEO, then next time you will be more careful about where you invest. So even if from a legal perspective, from an outside perspective, from whatever perspective, it's actually not your fault, it's better to operate as if everything is your fault. Because by imagining, by living by this idea, by operating as if everything is your fault, that gives you an immense amount of control. Because if it's your fault, it means that, well, you have some responsibility. But if you have some responsibility, it means that you had the opportunity to choose. You could have done A or B. You had a choice. You had some power. No one can be... It cannot be someone's fault if they have zero power, basically. A robot that just executes a program, it's never his fault. It's the fault of the person who programmed it. So if the robot kills someone by mistake, it's stupid for the programmer of the robot to blame the robot. Of course, it's his fault that there is a bug in his code. But this example can apply to basically everything. So everything that happened, of course, materially someone else probably did the issue or did the fuck up or whatever we want to call it. So it's looking from outside, it is someone else's fault. But if you do enough step backs, you can always reach a point like a fork in the road where you had a choice that could have prevented this. Now again, maybe it was not predictable. Let's say you have a driver, you have a car and you have a driver. The driver make an accident. Now, of course, everyone will agree that it's the fault of the driver. But maybe you could have picked a different driver. Or maybe the driver was going fast and you could have told him to slow down and you did not. Or maybe you could tell the driver was tired, he was closing his eye, and you still decide to continue instead of saying, look, you're tired, go home and sleep. Given enough step backs, every single thing is your fault. Because there is always a point, if you do enough step backs, that you could have prevented the thing that the other person did. And so this view is extremely empowering. It's the opposite of being victim. When you're a victim, when you feel you're a victim, you decide to give away your power. You say it's someone else's fault. There is nothing I could have done. And sure, maybe you don't feel some sort of blame or whatever, but you completely give away your power. You become powerless. So embracing victimhood is basically the same as embracing powerlessness. So if you want to be a victim, suit yourself, but then you are basically accepting that you will have no power. Now, of course, there are cases where some people have more power than others, but again, even if you have a little bit of power, every step back that you do, every realization that you do, that actually you could have changed the outcome by doing a change, going back enough step backs, you could have done something different. Like, let's say there is a war and in some country everyone dies and you also die. Of course, you can blame the president and this guy and that guy and the military and blah, blah, blah. But you could also not have went to that country. Or you could have left that country when maybe the first signals that a war was about to come were obvious. So I think this is really critical. It's like if someone wants more power, more influence in their life, for their own good, not power to crush others, power in the sense to have more control, to be empowered, to be able to influence their life in a better way, to make better decisions. It's really stupid to just blame someone else and say it's someone else's fault. You should never say that. I mean, of course, you can say it to them, but you should also think that it's completely your fault because you could have prevented it. Given enough step backs, you could have prevented it. And that gives you a lot of power. And so if you learn to live by this habit, you can really change everything, in my opinion. You can really have hundreds of times more power than you have now. To never be a victim, but because it's not about defining what a victim is or is not. It's really about, if you believe that it's not your fault, then you're a victim. But then you lose your power. If you believe that it is your fault always, because in some way or another you could have prevented it, you are never a victim, and that gives you a lot of power, which is going to change your life for the better in the future. So I think this is the right path, is to always assume that every single thing that happens to you is always 100% your fault. This is the trick in some way. This is the mental model. This is the perspective to have if you want to increase power over your life or your destiny. And it's not about tricks or manipulation or some body posture or some nonsense like this, which may actually work in some way for maybe persuasion or sales. Sure, you can make close more sales if you use some tricks. But this is much more deeper. This is much more powerful. Just assume that everything is always 100% your fault.